In this video, we're going to have a look at the development of the broad world trading system, having already looked at the specific role that governments can play in international trade. So here we're going to focus on some of the greater institutional frameworks around which some of this international trade may actually occur. And most of the time when people look at the development and establishment of the current world trading system, it's often traced back to the establishment of the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was a multilateral agreement that was established in 1947 and was certainly led by the US. They were the sort of chief advocates for the establishment of the GATT. Its membership grew from 23 founding members in 1947 all the way up to 128 members, until which point it was effectively replaced by the World Trade Organization. We'll talk about that in a minute. Its objective was to liberalise trade by eliminating trade barriers, so actively working against some of the instruments of trade that we've looked at over the last couple of videos. Attempts at the trade barrier removal were spread over 8 rounds. They recognised, the member countries recognised that you couldn't just click your fingers and just like that all of these trade barriers would be removed. They understood that it would take a number of repeat efforts to remove these trade barriers. And certainly initially they were very successful. We see here that in the US, since the first round, which was held in Geneva, way up until the Tokyo round, which was held in 1973, the average tariff rate had declined by nearly 92% there, so a significant reduction in these trade barriers. Unfortunately, by the 80s and 90s, there had been significant protectionist pressures which had emerged around the world. And this was due to a number of factors. Firstly, and perhaps chiefly, was the fact that Japan by now was the world's second largest economy overall, and certainly the largest exporter, but by many Western countries was perceived as being quite closed and adopting protectionist policies in terms of its imports and foreign direct investment through the imposition of administrative trade barriers. So not necessarily your traditional tariffs or subsidies, but other, especially legislative related ways that they could limit the level of imports and foreign direct investment into the country. And of course, many Western countries, which were being quite open themselves, were quite displeased by this. They were saying, well, that's not fair that we're opening ourselves up to Japanese business, but not being given the same opportunity to do so going back the other way. It was made even worse by the fact that around that time there was a persistent trade deficit in the United States. And when, of course, you have a trade deficit, this most commonly leads to higher levels of increased unemployment because there are more and more firms locally which simply are not able to compete against these increasing imports, and this was of course made worse by the situation with Japan, and that in turn called for and led to a lot of calls by many of the local producers for protection by the US government. In addition, many countries by now had found ways to sort of get around many of these regulations imposed by the GATT. And one of these we've talked about previously today was the use of bilateral voluntary export restraints. So when the Japanese and US governments agreed that the Japanese firms would be limited in how many cars they could import into the US, that was a good example there. And so by the time we got to the latest round of the GATT, the Uruguay round, things were a little testy. This whole idea for further reducing barriers to trade wasn't so much in vogue. Yet despite this, they did push on with the 8th round of the GATT, which, as I say, was held in Uruguay. Now, unfortunately, Uruguay has since become known as a country perhaps most famous for a particular soccer player who just liked to have a bit of a nibble on his opponents. Luis Suarez, there he is, just having a bit of a bite. And if you think this is a one-off thing, it wasn't. Look, nom, 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 there he goes. So before this all happened, though, they did hold a very important historical occasion in terms of the world trading system. And at this Uruguay round, which was commenced in 1986 and took 7 years for it to be agreed upon, which so was therefore eventually ratified in 93 and took effect in 1995, they further aimed to reduce those tariff barriers, but they also focused on agricultural subsidies as a specific area they wanted to reduce, and importantly started to look at services. Most of the, up until now, the areas where they looked to free up trade was mainly in manufacturing industries. They now look to services as well. So there were barriers to trade in terms of textiles that were reduced. Importantly, especially from a service perspective, a lot of the intellectual property rights were strengthened, and most important of all, it led to the formation of the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Now, as I say, this was created in 1995 and was based in Geneva, which is in Switzerland. You can see an actual image of its headquarters there, very nice old building. Its role was to implement the Uruguay round of agreements from the GATT, but importantly it was now an organisation, so it wasn't just a document or an agreement like the GATT. It now was an actual physical entity which encompassed the GATT along with two sister organisations, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS, and the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. We've talked about that a little bit already in the semester. So its role here was to act as the World Trade Advocate and really encourage nations to adopt non-discriminatory, predictable trade policies. And as I say, this was difficult at the time because it flew in the face of what a lot of the pressures were pushing towards around the world. Its role was to also enforce trade rules and extending the GATT to cover those non-tariff barriers which were starting to emerge. It reduced existing tariff barriers from 40% to 5% in manufactured goods, so it did a good work there, and also acted as the international trade police and were responsible for trade arbitration. So we talked about this way back in week 1, where they were the governing body there in terms of how international trade was supposed to be upheld, and also what aimed at least to resolve some of those key disputes that happened as a consequence of international trade. So just to summarise, in terms of the key differences here, obviously the WTO was is an organisation relative to the agreement form of the GATT. It did extend that role to consider non-tariff barriers and thus consider things beyond just trade issues. It also has the ability to influence domestic policy, so it can limit as a governing body what non-tariff policies countries are actually able to implement, and goes beyond, as I mentioned before, just specific trade issues to consider things like health and safety, culture, workers' rights, and so on. And perhaps most important of all, it was just a lot tougher in enforcement, although perhaps not as tough in its enforcement as our man Walker, Texas Ranger. But you get the point that here that because they're an actual organisation rather than just a document, there was actually somebody to police what was going on rather than sort of just a document that people were able to overlook and not consider. Now in the next video we're going to have a look at not only some of the positives which have come out overall from the establishment of the WTO, but also some of the controversy that surrounds this very important organisation.